This lesson video will wrap up some key information we need to understand symbolization in truth-functional logic. The two concepts we're going to cover, ambiguity and the meta-language, will address two different aspects of what we've studied. So ambiguity poses a problem for symbolizing English sentences. That was the main focus of our first 4 videos in this lesson. The concept of a meta-language is important for understanding how we talk about a logical system. And that builds on what we did in the 5th video and will continue to be important in the next few weeks. So the main goals in this lesson are for you to recognize different types of ambiguity and the potential for ambiguity in English to complicate symbolization into truth-functional logic. You should be able to identify whether a word is being used or mentioned, and have a sense of how to distinguish the object language and the meta-language, and we'll talk about what those terms mean. So we'll start with our discussion of ambiguity. A sentence is ambiguous when it can be interpreted as having more than one meaning. So our first example will be, Marco saw a bat in the corner. That's ambiguous between a reading where Marco saw a small flying mammal in the corner and one where Marco saw a piece of sporting equipment in the corner. The word bat has these two different meanings. This is called lexical ambiguity. It's ambiguity in the meaning of the English word bat. Most of the time, it'll be clear from context which one of these things a speaker means, but in logic, it's sometimes relevant to specify which meaning a speaker intended. For example, it can affect whether or not 2 sentences have the same subject matter. So you can't say reason from a premise about bats, the animals, to a conclusion about bats, the sporting equipment. Ambiguity can also arise even when the meanings of all of the individual words are clear. So, everybody loves somebody is another ambiguous sentence. One meaning is everybody in the world loves at least one other person. Sue loves Ahmed, Juan loves Martine, and so on and so on. On the other reading, everybody in the world loves one person. So on the second reading, the sentence would be true if everybody was in love with Beyonce. Where these two readings are generated not by the meanings of the words, but how the sentence is laid out, is structural ambiguity. The grammar is what makes the sentence ambiguous. This type of ambiguity can affect how we structure our symbolization in truth-functional logic. Because of that, how we interpret it can affect the inferences we can draw from it. So if the arguer meant two above, we can conclude there is one person that everybody loves. But we can't draw that same conclusion from one. Now first, we're going to compare these two examples, and the first one is unambiguous in English, but it can be symbolized in 2 ways in truth-functional logic. So the sentence is, Dale is serious and Catherine is devious and Pete is naive. So we see the 3 atomic sentences there that make this up, and the simple statement letters we've assigned to them. And then we get 2 symbolizations that are possible from the sentence. D and K in parentheses, and P, that in parentheses. So our 2 conjuncts for the main connective, the right-hand conjunction, are P on one side and D and K on the other. But there's an equivalent symbolization for this, where D is one conjunct of the main connective and K and P is another conjunct of the main connective. Either one of these would be an acceptable symbolization of the English, in part because these 2 logical forms are equivalent. So there's no ambiguity here, and even though there's 2 symbolizations, there's no logical difference between the symbolizations except in the order of the parentheses. But sometimes we must symbolize English sentences by resolving ambiguity. We have to figure out which of two meanings was intended so that we can symbolize the statement accurately. So in the first example we looked at, the parentheses didn't create a difference in meaning, but in the second example here, they'll make a distinction between two meanings of the ambiguous sentence of English and two different symbolizations. So our ambiguous sentence is Gersten or Donna and Harriet have musical talent. So again, we see our 3 sentence letters and 3 associated atomic sentences there. And we have 2 different symbolizations. One is G or D as one conjunct and H as the other. And the other has G as a disjunct and D and H as the other disjunct. These alternative symbolizations for the second example are not equivalent. The one on the left tells you that at least 2 of these girls are musically talented, Harriet and either Gersten or Donna. The second one says that Gersten is talented or Donna and Harriet are. So these 2 symbolizations capture 2 different meanings. On this slide and the next one, we're going to look at a couple more specific examples of ambiguity. First one arises from conjunction, the second one arises from disjunction. So remember that we use conjunction to describe 2 separate situations, facts, or events. The challenge is that some sentences that contain the word and are ambiguous between a reading that requires we symbolize it with conjunction and one that doesn't. So in particular, we're going to look at ones that are ambiguous between describing a joint action and describing separate actions. So our sentence is going to be, Jackie and Hannah lifted the piano. The first reading is one where Jackie and Hannah worked together to lift a piano. So you can imagine they're moving, each one grabs a side. But there is another reading. It's where Jackie lifted a piano on her own and Hannah lifted a piano on her own. So they're both very strong. That first reading is called a collective reading. And it's the one that can't be represented with conjunction. Instead, it's represented with the single statement letter. That's because it describes a single fact that involves 2 people and a piano. So we would symbolize it with, say, L, Jackie and Hannah lifted the piano. The second reading is called a distributive reading. And that one we would represent with conjunction because it's 2 separate facts. Jackie lifted the piano and Hannah lifted the piano. So we could symbolize these as J and H and get J conjunction H as our symbolization. So this English sentence, Jackie and Hannah lifted the piano, is ambiguous between 2 meanings, and each of those meanings can be given a different symbolization in truth functional logic. A restricted set of sentences that contain or are also ambiguous between a reading that uses disjunction and one that does not. So sentences that use or in the context of certain psychological attitude verbs like want or fear or hope are ambiguous. So our example here is Nick wants to go to grad school in physics or engineering. One of the things this sentence can mean is that Nick wants either one of these outcomes, but is indifferent between the 2. That one describes his state of indifference and can't be translated with logical disjunction. So we would assign this long sentence a single sentence letter. It would be an atomic sentence. The other meaning is the one where Nick wants to go to grad school in physics, or he wants to go to grad school in engineering. So he definitely wants one or 2, but likely the speaker would say this if they don't know which one he wants. That's the one that could be translated with logical disjunction, where Nick wants to go to grad school in physics, or he wants to go to grad school in engineering are the 2 disjuncts. When you're symbolizing sentences of English, watch out for ones that are ambiguous, because those will sometimes require multiple symbolizations to capture all the possible meanings.